Yes, hello to you all once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, where we do our very best to try and bring you more of those old school classic motocross machines from a way back in the day when, of course, at that time our particular sport was called scrambling. Now, if you're a brand new subscriber to CDB TV, then thank you very much for taking the time to subscribe, and I hope you continue to find more interesting machines to look at here on my channel. And also a big thanks to everybody who continues to leave positive, well, mainly positive comments on my video posting, so thanks again for that. Now, coming up next, we're going to take a look at a lovely trio of British classics. Now, all three of these bikes are, of course, not fully stock original machines from the period, but nevertheless, they're still a lovely trio of classic race bikes. So let's get into that video now and take a look at Ian Ridley's lovely BSA Victors. Okay, so as I just mentioned, in this next video posting, we're going to take a look at a very nice trio of British-built classic BSAs, and these three beauties here are just a few of the many machines that Cumbrian motorcycle racer and collector Ian Ridley has in his workshop of vintage off-road classics. So these pictures were actually taken a few years back, but still at that time I was quite lucky to have all three bikes in one place at one time in order to get some of these snaps of what is essentially a very unique collection of British built motorcycles. Now, at the time of taking these pictures, Ian was still racing these beloved BSAs, although these days maybe not so much, because Ian does have his Ridley transport company to run, and of course not forgetting that Ian owns and maintains his own motocross racing facility at Whittis Park in Bassenthwaite. So without doubt, Ian certainly got a lot of stuff on his plate these days, but hopefully during the winter shutdown we'll maybe make a date to visit Ian's workshop and take a look at some of the very interesting classics that he's got tucked away. Now, most of this trio of BSAs do have many similarities between them, with most of them having quite similar chassis, but maybe slightly different specs in the engine department. But beginning with this number 15 bike, and although I was never actually told on the day, I'm not entirely sure as to the origins of this bike's chassis, which I suspect could be a replacement or reproduction frame, maybe even one of those Faber chassis, judging by the quality of its construction. But as I said, I'm in guessing mode as far as this bike's chassis is concerned. But straight away you can see that it's very high quality, and of course this frame here has been chrome plated as well. But the engine that powers this particular BSA Victor is stamped as a B44SS motor, which I'm pretty certain is an old Shooting Star engine, which as you can see has had a bit of work done on the cylinder, whereby some modifications have taken place, with every second cooling fin on the barrel being removed, which I can only assume is to reduce the weight and to stop mud and crud jamming between the fins when the bike's being raced in quite muddy condition. Of course, it also gives this stock B44 engine a completely new look to the standard BSA that you would see on maybe a BSA Scrambler or road bike. Now, once again, this modified engine casing here is another quite common upgrade on these Scrambler singles, but I think this casing cutaway is simply a weight-saving issue more than a performance improvement. But then again, it also makes the external oil filtration pipes much easier to gain access for any kind of maintenance or servicing that's required. And of course, the new external oil filtration system replaces what would have been the engine's internal oil filter that captured all of that microscopic debris that got pumped around the engine. Because as you know, these old Victors did hold their engine oil in the chassis, just like many of the other British-built bikes of their day. But this brand new oil filtration system with its external pipes and simple screw-on cartridge filter is a much more efficient and easier maintained setup than the old-fashioned BSA original. But once again, all three bikes that you're about to see have been upgraded to a super reliable and virtually maintenance-free CDI electronic ignition, which is certainly a world apart from the archaic contact breaker ignitions that these engines had back in the 1960s. But the exhaust system on our BSA engine here was a big bore straight through pipe, which never really had anything in the way of baffles or damping to try and quieten down that nice throaty grunt that came from this BSA engine. But this pipe here did have a short tailpipe that came out of the right-hand side of the chassis. But this was more or less just to really direct the exhaust gases away from the bike, rather than having anything to do with lowering the decibels of that B44 power plant. But as we move onto the front end of our first BSA Victor, I'm pretty sure that these front forks here are a set of Italian Serianis, because the other two bikes are also fitted with Seriani front forks. And these old Victor Scramblers did make good use of these Italian forks, which in the late 1960s and early 70s were widely used on many different kinds of British off-road and even some road bikes as well during that period. And in terms of their performance, these forks did work quite well, considering their time frame and the technology of their day. And also, as you'd expect, for the 1960s, it was a pair of old school drum brakes that were used as a pair of stoppers on the front and at the rear of these old Victors. But with regards to the actual identity of these hubs, I'm not familiar with what kind they are on this bike, but I expect they might even possibly be a pair of alloy Gramica hubs, but certainly don't quote me on that particular point. But at the end of the day, these old drum and shoe type systems were still perfectly adequate for these bikes, because these old Victors weren't exactly heavy machines. And here at the rear end of our BSA, which back in the day would have probably had just a simple pair of maybe girdling dampers or something similar fitted to its rear suspension system. But thankfully, in these modern times nowadays, you're kind of spoilt for choice and specifications when it comes to choosing your bike's rear shocks. And on this particular example here, Ian's bolted on a pair of Dutch-made Riger classic shocks, which are a world apart from those old Girlings, which, as rear shocks go, were certainly very basic dampers in the 1960s and 70s. And here at the top of the chassis, it's the stock standard BSA Victor alloy fuel tanks. It's fitted on all three of these bikes with the usual logo and Victor paint scheme. But these fuel cells here usually held more than enough gas to keep the B44 four-stroke motor fed with its fuel. And another part on the filler side of this tank was the usual Monza style locking fuel cap there on the top, which again was pretty much a standard fit on most of these Victor fuel cells. Although, as you can see, it's a quality old classic, not of course your stock standard BSA Victor from the golden era of scrambling, because many of Ian's motorbikes are all personalised anyhow, as you're about to see. But this bike here, along with the other two, are certainly not just show bikes, although some of them have won trophies and prizes at concourse judging events or motorcycle shows. But essentially, all three of these bikes are still raced on a regular basis. So moving on to Ian Ridley's second BSA Victor Classic, and this example here, as you can see, is again slightly different from the previous machine, but essentially this one here is based around a Faber chassis and yet another B44 BSA engine. And once more, this example here also has its very own colour scheme with that fantastic blue coloured Faber chassis, and of course the yellow side panels as well. Now, the skinny and quite often slippy footrest that you used to find on the original Victor Scramblers weren't exactly the best for keeping your feet planted on the footrests and prevent them from slipping off. But all three of Ian's racers here have all had upgrades, as you can see, and those once slippy and skinny items have now been replaced by these super wide and grippy Raptor pegs, which are certainly a big improvement over those Victor originals, and will certainly offer more support for the rider's feet as well. But I'm pretty sure that you're already aware that these Faber frames still used the chassis to house the engine's motor oil, where it was held in the frame's front down tube and then pumped around the engine and eventually back into the top of the chassis. And once more, this engine here's had the upgraded external cartridge type oil filter system fitted, which, as I said earlier, is another big improvement over that simple little gauze type filter that was originally fitted onto this bike. So as we move on to the power plant on this number 51 bike, which is another BSA B44 VS or Victor special, but whether any internal modifications have actually been carried out on this particular engine, I'm not sure, although I expect that this engine here won't be a stock standard power plant, because all three bikes belonging to Ian have had some kind of upgrades or work done on them to one degree or another. But when Ian builds his bikes, then usually cost isn't a factor, and it's always quality parts that are used in their construction. So on this right hand side of this engine, you can see that the casings had some kind of surgery, as of course in our previous bike, and I'm pretty sure that this work here was carried out by RTS in Eldersfield, or RTS Racing Products, as I think they are now known. But RTS certainly specialise in parts and all kinds of engineering work on all manner of BSA engines, and basically RTS are just a one-stop shop for everything that you need for your classic BSA when it comes to obtaining parts or requiring other engine work. But you can see that the fuel on this engine here is supplied through an AMAL concentric carburetor, which is slightly more efficient than those earlier monoblock units that were often fitted to this engine. And inside the alloy custom-made airbox, it's a much more modern type foam air filter that's used to capture any dust or micro deposits that enter the air intake. But without question, these old B44 engines were still very good four-stroke engines for their day. Not, of course, super powerful, because this was still essentially a road bike engine, but with a few little upgrades and a bit of tuning and fettling, then these old BSA engines can still be quite a lot of fun and quite competitive if you get the right rider sitting in the pilot's seat. But once more, and as in our previous bike, it's a big bore straight through exhaust system, which again is all custom made to fit around the engine and of course that Faber chassis. And our 51 machine here does have a small tailpipe at the rear, although it doesn't have any baffles or dampeners inside to soften that nice growl from the four-banger BSA engine. And also on this engine here, it still has the stock B44 barrel with all of its cooling fins still intact, unlike our previous example that had the mechanical surgery to remove every second fin on the barrel. So the front suspension on our Faber BSA uses a pair of re-engineered billet alloy triple clamps or yokes to replace what would have been the originals that would have come with the Italian Seriani forks. But these Seriani suspension systems, as I said, are a perfect choice for these old scramblers, because they were certainly light and quite simple to maintain, although naturally these weren't as good as the motorcycle suspensions that we enjoy nowadays, but as I said, for their time they did a very decent job. And here at the back of our BSA Victor, it's a pair of classic Falcon shocks this time, which I can certainly recommend, because I did have a similar pair of Falcon shocks on the back of my old 440 Michael when I raced it back in the day, and I always found these Falcons to work very well on all manner of tracks, whether bumpy, rough or whatever. So again, you can see that Ian continues to fit quality items onto his BSA race machines. So on again to the bike's fuel tank, which is your stock alloy BSA Victor fuel cell once more, with another nice custom paint job with the blue and yellow colour scheme, and of course the Faber frame logo there as well. But the entire colour scheme of this bike here is a copy of the colours that Ian paints his trucks in on his Ridley transportation business. So maybe if you're out and about and driving around the UK, and you might even come across some nice big trucks with this metallic blue and bright yellow coloured layout, and the chances are that it could even possibly be one of Ian's rigs. But as in our previous BSA, this tank here also has the Monza style locking fuel cap there on the top. But certainly back in the 1960s, these old Victor Scramblers weren't known for their comfort while they were on the track, because they did have very little in the way of travel at the rear suspension department, and these skinny seats here didn't exactly help much either. But this is what some of the old British scramble stars had to contend with at that time, so they certainly must have been made of quite stern stuff, because they'd more than likely take a battering with very little damping of the suspension, and what looks like it could have been a quite hard seat. But most of the controls on all three of Ian's bikes are basically modern replacements to the old original parts, and here we've got quite a good pair of Renthal bars with a pair of Magura levers and a modern gasser throttle there, along of course with a decompressor lever and an engine kill switch, just in case anything should go wrong with that BSA engine and it needs to be shut down in a hurry. But as you can see, this is another fantastic specimen of an old BSA Victor, which back in the 1960s would have had alloy mudguards on the front and at the rear, and of course alloy side panels there as well. Although I must say, even with these modern day kind of mudguard plastics in that blue Faber chassis, I still think that this is a much nicer looking motorcycle than its 1960s counterpart. So that then brings us on to our third and final Ian Ridley BSA, and this number 155 machine here is loosely based around what I think is a BSA chassis, which could be original or maybe even a reproduction frame, because as I mentioned at the front of the video, I didn't actually get the full specifications of all three bikes from Ian on the day that I grabbed these shots. But nevertheless, you can see that it's another immaculately turned out motorcycle once again. Now, according to the engine number that's stamped on the bottom of this engine's barrel, this is a B40 engine that's been slotted into this particular chassis, which I'm assuming is a 350 engine, which as I remember, I think was a further development of the smaller C15 250 BSA engine, which again, as you can see, has had the now familiar engine casing surgery and of course that upgraded engine oil filtration system again fitted that we showed you in the other examples. Now, I do remember that these old B40s had a wet multi-plate oil-cooled clutch, and as I remember, I think it was a 4-speed gearbox as well. And in its stock standard trim, these 350s would put out around the 20-odd horsepower bracket, but of course, once you got your mitts on the engine and then did a bit of work and tuning on the motor, then you could certainly improve the power and the performance of this once dull road bike engine. But when it comes to engine preparation, all three power plants on Ian's racers are all fitted with the very best quality parts that you can lay your hands on. So these engines here are all in tip-top condition, which not only makes them quick, but generally very reliable as well. But as you're aware, I've already mentioned that all three of Ian Ridley's racers are using these well-proven Italian Serianis, and on this number 155 bike we have much the same make of forks. And these Serianis were certainly used, as I said, on many different makes and models of motorcycles back in the 1960s and 70s, and even today they're much sought after items to use on these old school BSAs and other British built scrambles machines. And this time here at the back of this bike, it's another pair of Dutch made Riger suspension units, which are much the same as the rear suspension units that we showed you on our first Victor Scrambles machine. But these Rigers, as I said, are very well made, and they do perform well in most track conditions. And of course the other plus point here is that these shocks are all fully rebuildable with regards any maintenance and of course tuning if you want to customize them to suit the rider's own personal weight and riding style. And you can also see here that Ian's made some improvements here at the back of the bike with this custom made combined alloy brake hub anchor and chain guide. And I think the original rear brake rod that was made of steel has been changed to a much simpler cable operated system. And of course it's a much more traditional type of colour scheme on this number 155 bike's fuel tank, with the polished alloy rear patches there and the traditional BSA logo and of course British Union Jack flag just below it. But it was normally about, I think it was about 2 gallons of fuel that these Victor alloy tanks held, so that, as I said, was usually more than enough to keep that 350 four-stroke engine running on even the longest of Scrambles races. And once more here in the pilot's control centre, we have much the same setup we had in the 2 previous machines, with the usual Renthal handlebars, Magura levers and their rubber covers, and of course a good quality gasser throttle twist grip there, along with again a decompressor lever just to help lower that engine's compression to make it a bit easier to start. But if you're a regular visitor to some of the classic scramble events in Scotland, or maybe even in Cumbria in the north of England, then you'll probably already be very familiar with Ian's BSA Victors, because as I mentioned previously, when these bikes are all cleaned up, they're certainly good enough to win any kind of motorcycle show or even concourse competition event, which they've already done in the past many times. But essentially their main purpose is to have them racing on the track each and every weekend. And in this next few select pictures, you can see that not only are these bikes nice to look at, Ian uses them very regularly, almost every other weekend when he takes the bikes out to local vintage or twin shock scramble events. But they're superb machines, as you can see, but not just concourse and shiny show bikes. These bikes of Ian's are made for one thing only, and that of course is for racing them on the track. But without doubt, these are a lovely trio of old scramblers, and who knows, maybe if your plan is to head along to a classic scramble sometime soon, and if you do live in the north of England, especially near Penrith or Kendal, then I'm pretty sure that you'll catch a glimpse of these bikes, not only sitting around the paddock, but doing their stuff on the racetrack as well. So as I said, so hopefully sometime soon we'll be able to dive into Ian's Aladdin's cave of classic motorbikes again, and maybe bring you more of his vintage racers for you to drool over. So in this picture here, we can see the lovely Helen Cahill there on the left, who actually races one of these Victors, and on the right is, of course, the man himself, Ian Ridley, pictured beside another bike from his collection, his 1975 500 CCM, which again, as you can see, is all painted up in Ian's own personal livery. So there you have it. It's just a small sample there of the very high quality bikes that Ian has in his possession, possibly the nicest trio of old BSA Victors that you could ever wish to come across. But who actually cares if these bikes are not original Victors, because Ian's certainly made sure that he's added his own personal identity to his particular motorcycle collection. And to tell you the truth, I just can't wait to see more of the same. So this bike here is the next project that we're going to feature on Classic Dirt Bike TV, and this is Paul Armour's 1980 414 Montesa Capra, an almost fully original bike from that year. So I do hope that you make sure that you return or even subscribe to CDB TV so as not to miss out on this next featured bike. But until the next time, thanks again for watching, and it's goodbye for now.